Okay, so we are picking up today's daf in Meretz Hashem is Samich Aleph 61, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on 60b Samich Hamad Beis. Actually, a lot to do. So we're picking up on Samich Hamad Beis Ma Sheniskar Hum Mafsid. So we'll say, I think I have it under control. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you. Ma Sheniskar Hum Mafsid. So remember again, the Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, when you go ahead and you extend your tchum in one direction, whatever you gain in one direction, you lose in another direction. So it says the Gemara, Masheniskar v'sulo, is that true? It's just whatever you gain, or as we'll say. So the Mishnah makes it sound like it's a direct relationship. So, for every amma you gain, let's say, for example, in the east, you go ahead and you lose an amma in the west. Says the Gemara, is that true? That's it. If a person goes ahead and puts their Eruv inside of the Ibor. So remember, again, we spoke about this yesterday already. Person puts their Eruv within the 70 2/3 Amma boundary right outside the city. Afilu, so the Gemara says, Elo asav lo klum. So also that's irrelevant. We spoke about this before. Because halacha l'maisa, anyway, your tchum is only counted from the edge of the Ibor, right? It begins being counted at the 70 2/3 mark. So placing your Eruv inside the 70 2/3 doesn't really do or accomplish anything. Thank you. Doesn't accomplish anything. Says the Gemara, however, nasno chutz li'ibura, but if you go and you place your Eruv outside of the 70 2/3 amas, afilu ama achos, mistakir osa ama. So we'll say, but if you go ahead and you place your Eruv outside of even an amma outside of the 70 2/3 amas, so you go ahead and you gain an additional amma. So we'll say, so remember again, just to illustrate, very simple is what we've been learning this entire time. You have 2,000 amas from the edge of the city. What we've been introduced to is the concept that edge of the city doesn't actually just mean edge of the city. Rather, what does edge of the city mean? 70 2/3 amas from the edge of the city. Now, obviously, if you wanted, so if you put your Eruv within the 70 2/3 amas, that Eruv hasn't accomplished anything, because anyway, you're counting the 2,000 from the edge of the 70 2/3. But if you go ahead and you place your Eruv outside of the 70 2/3, that's when you begin to extend your tchum. So if you were to go ahead and let's say place it an amma outside of the 70 2/3 amas, so you would gain more. Let's go. We're doing this in the east. You would gain additional amas in the east. But for every amma that you gain in the east, osa amma umafsides kolair kula. So you go ahead, but on the west side, you would go ahead and lose the entire city. Why? So we'll say this is actually very interesting. So what the Gemara is suggesting is the following. So imagine the following situation. You want to extend your tchum to the east. So what you do is you go ahead, you measure, right, you go to the 70 2/3 amas outside of the city. That's really where you begin to measure your tchum. You then go ahead and place your Eruv an amma outside of the 70 2/3. Beautiful. So now you'll begin to measure your tchum from the east side. What the Bryce is now suggesting, Abosai, is you lose everything on the west side. So what that means is you have 2,000 amas obviously from your home to the west also. But that 2,000 amas is calculated from your home and not from the edge of the city on the west side. Which means that when you make an Eruv to the east, you're not only losing. See, the Mishnah makes it sound like for every amma you gain in the east, you lose an amma in the west. The Bryce just pointed out, no, that's not true. You lose a lot more. For every amma you gain in the east, you've lost the entire city in the west. See, both sides. Remember, before you make an Eruv, you have 2,000 ammas in every direction as measured from where? From the edge of the city. Once you decide to make an Eruv in a particular direction, and you place that Eruv outside of the 70 2/3 Ibor of the city, the Bryce is suggesting you lose the city on every other side. So that now, if you want to go ahead and you want to measure your westward tchum, halacha l'maaseh, you have to start from your home. And if it ends 2,000 amas inside of the city, that's where it ends. So we'll say, so which one is this? So kasha. So says the Gemara, We'll say everything depends when you, so again, let's keep with the same case. I'm extending my tchum to the east. So now again, I will say when I want to see what my tchum to the west is, I'm going to count 2,000 amas from my home. And here's what everything depends on. If halacha l'maisa, the 2,000 amas in the west end in the middle of the city, then that's where they end. If the tchum ends outside of the city, then the entire city on the west side is reckoned as dalet amas, as we'll see in just a moment. And halacha l'maisa, I continue to count from the edge of the city and onward. So interestingly enough, the Gemara is making a fascinating distinction. If you extend your Eruv to the east, it's true that you lose tchum to the west. How much? Depends on how much of the city to the west there is. If when counting 2,000 amas you end inside of the city, that's what you got. That's what you got. If, however, your 2,000 amas ends outside of the city, then Einach Inami, the city itself, is going to be reckoned only as dalet amas, and you'll continue counting from the edge of the city and onward. Ukud Rav Idi, Dam Rav Idi, Am Rav Yeshua ben Levi, Hayamoded Uba. If a person is measuring his tchum, the kal simidasa bechatzia year. So we'll say, in general, a person is measuring his tchum, and his tchum is 2,000 amas end in the middle of a particular city. Then what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Eino ela chatzia year. That's where your tchum ends. That's all you have. Kal samidasa b'sofa year. But also, let's say a person is measuring his tchum. So we actually had this case before. I live in city A. And I'm measuring my tchum, 2,000 amas, and it happens to be that 2,000 amas ends in the middle of city B. That's where it ends. So Rav Idi Bar Avin says, okay, if it ends, so Rav Idi says, if it ends in the middle of city B, that's where your tchum ends. However, b'sofa year, but let's say Rabosai, my tchum ends at the end of city B, then what? Nasis lo ha'ir kula kedalet amas umashlimin lo es hashar. So it's a fascinating halacha, Rav Idi says, that if my tchum ends at the edge of city B, then all of city B is looked at as dalet amas, and halacha l'maisa, I continue to count the remainder of the tchum from there. So we'll say, so just to illustrate one more time, I live in city A. I have 2,000 amas from my home. So what's going to happen? I count my 2,000 amas. So my 2,000 amas, possibility is my 2,000 amas end in the middle of city B. Okay? End in the middle of city B. What's the halacha? That's it. That's where your tchum ends. Let's say my tchum ends at the end of city B. At the end of city B. So if Edie says in that case, all of the we'll call it square footage of city B is looked at as just dalet amas, and you continue to count the remainder of your tchum from the edge of city B. So the Gemara says, Rav Idi said, Ein ela divrei nevius. So Rav Idi said, and I remember again, I want to point out, Rav Idi said this over in the name of Rav Yeshua ben Levi. Then Rav Idi himself said, all of this are words of prophecy. And Rav said, now that's not meant as a compliment. What he's saying is ultimately, again, there's no rhyme or reason for this. This halacha, I'm saying it over in the name of Rav Yeshua ben Levi, but at the end of the day, I don't really understand it. I don't think it actually makes sense. After all, Mali kalsa b'chatziyah, Mali kalsa b'sofir. We'll say, why should it make a difference? I don't understand. Why is there a distinction? If my tchum ends in the middle of city B, then halacha l'maisa, that's the tchum ends. But if my tchum ends at the end of city B, then suddenly again all of city B is looked at as dalet amas. Why? How do you know to make that distinction? So Amarava tarvayu tanani. So Rava said, in reality, we've learned both of these concepts from where Anshi Ir Gidola. So we'll say this is actually a very interesting case. This is, if you're following in the pictures. This is picture 230. Actually, the truth is you can see 229 and 230. You'll be able to see again, 229 is the concept that we just spoke about before, where the tchum ends in the middle of the city or at the end of the city. 230 is going to speak about the concept of Ir Gidola, Ir Kitana. So watch this. It says the Gemara. Amar Rava, Anshe Ir Gidola, the residents of a large city, Mahalchin es kol Ir Kitana, could walk through the entirety of a small city. Or Bosen Shabbos, top of Samach Aleph, Ve'in Anshe Ir Kitana, but the residents of a small city, Ve'in Anshe Ir Kitana, Mahalchin es kol Ir Gidola. But we'll say the residents of the small city cannot walk through the entirety of the large city. Okay, so we'll say, so obviously, there's a lot to be explained over here. What exactly does this mean? So the Gemara says, my taima, La mishum dahani kalsa midasa mechatzir, v'ani kalsa midasa mesofeir. So the Rav Idi, I'm sorry. So therefore again, the Gemara suggests as follows. What's the case here? The case over here is where you have a large city and a small city which border each other. So the Brisa says that, or the Mishnah says, that the residents of the large city can walk through the entirety of the small city. The residents of the small city cannot walk through the entirety of the large city. But why is that? So the Gemara is suggesting, well, maybe it's the following. The residents of the large city, their tchum actually goes through or goes to the end of the small city. If the tchum ends at the edge of the small city, then what's the halacha? The entirety of the small city is simply reckoned as dalet amas, and therefore again you could continue to count the tchum from there. Whereas the residents of the small city, their tchum ends in the middle of the large city, and halacha l'maisa, when a tchum ends in the middle of a large city, all you have is what? Is the amount of tchum that you've measured. For Rav Idi's version of this, he says anshe tani. So Rav say in Rav Idi's version of this, he actually has it, the way he read it was, the residents of the small city can walk through the entirety of the large city. The residents of the large city can walk through the entirety of the small city. So how does he set up this case? Umokim la benosein. And I want to say that's talking about a case where a person actively places his eruv down, aval moded lotnan. But halacha l'maaseh, he does not go ahead and deal with a case of a person measuring their tchum. Now, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Rav Idi, da'amar divrei nevuah hein, anshe katanu b'masnisin, betarvayu tani mahalchin, umoki la benosin eruva be'ir kid mafarshim masnisin. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, Rav Idi understands this as a case of placing an eruv. Now, we'll say, now halacha l'maaseh, Rav Idi will say like this, and we'll say there's a lot going on over here. So remember, before we get to Rav Idi, what the Gemara is trying to prove is the following assertion. If when you're measuring your tchum from your home, your tchum ends in the middle of a city, that's where it ends. If your tchum ends at the edge of the city, and when I say edge of the city, let's say the external edge, or for that matter, past the city, then the city as a whole that your tchum runs through is just looked at as dalet amas. Now, both say that's huge. That's huge because if the city is only looked at as dalet amas, that means what? You have all of that additional amos measurement to now go forward past the city. Rav Idi understands. Rav Idi quoted that halacha, but he was the one who said it doesn't make any sense to me. Rav Idi understands this brisa as reading as follows. The residents of a large city can walk through the entirety of a small city. Residents of a small city can walk through the entirety of a large city. And how does he set it up? He's introducing something else. There's a difference, I will say, when you measure your tchum just simply through walking versus when you go ahead and you place an eruv somewhere. Rav Idi says, when you place an eruv in a city, you become like a resident of that city. When you become like a resident of that city, then the entirety of the city is reckoned as dalet amas. So if I'm a resident of a large city and I place my eruv in the small city, the entire small city becomes like my dalet amas. I'm a resident of the small city, I place my eruv in the large city, the entire city becomes like my dalet amas. So the Gemara says, "V'lo is that tshuva hatnan ulamoded shamru nosn lo apayim ama shafilu sof midaso kala b'ma'ara sofa'ir." I'm sorry, so I'll say, but 1 second. But doesn't Rav Idi say, doesn't the Mishnah say, that if a person is measuring their tchum, they're both say, so remember again, literally I'm just measuring out 2,000 amas. And what happens? Let's say my 2,000 amas ends in a cave. So we'll say, what's the halacha? To which the Gemara says, Sofa ir to lotanan. He still needed to include the case of Sofa ir, the edge of the city, for that was not mentioned in the Mishnah. So both say, so fundamental machlokes. Rav Idi, although he calls Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, does not seem to subscribe to that concept that he holds that where your tchum ends, your tchum ends. The only exception Rav Idi will say is if you're placing an eruv in a city. If you place an eruv in a city, then the entire city becomes like your dalet amas. But if you're just measuring by foot, right, you're just walking 2,000 amas, wherever your 2,000 amas end, that's where they end. So the Gemara says, Amrav Nachman, man detani anshi lo mishtabish, man detani ein anshi lo mishtabish. So Rav Nachman says either version of the Mishnah we read works. So whether you read it as the residents of the large city can walk through the small city, but the residents of the small city cannot walk through the large city. Or you read it, that both the residents of the large city and small city can walk through each other. You're correct. Mandatani anshi lo mishtabish demokim lo benosim. So say if you hold that the Mishnah is saying that that the residents of both cities can walk through each other's cities, that's talking about a case where you placed the Eruv in the respective city. Okay? So if you place the Eruv in the respective city, then halacha l'maisa, the entire city becomes like your Dalet Amis. Umandatani ein anshi, and the opinion that reads it as that the residents of the large city can walk through the small city, but the residents of the small city cannot walk through the large city. Lo mishtabish, that's also not a mistake in reading demokim la b'moded. That's talking about a case, ultimately, again, where you are measuring out your tchum v'chisuri mechsura v'hachi katoni. And in fact, it's missing a piece, and here's how it has to be read. Here we go. Anshe ir gidola mahalchin es kol ir kitana. The residents of a large city can walk through the entirety of a small city. Ve'ein anshe ir kitana mahalchin es kol ir gidola. But the residents of the small city cannot walk through the entirety of the large city. When is that true? The moded. Both say that's true when you're just simply measuring out, actively measuring out your tchum. So we'll say, so what that means is again that halacha l'maisa, well, we'll see if it's halacha l'maisa, but the idea is that if I'm measuring out my 2,000 amas, where my 2,000 amas end, that's where they end. Middle of the city, it doesn't make a difference. Where they end, they end. Ava misha haya bi'ir gidola, v'eniach es eruva bi'ir kitana. Haya bi'ir kitana v'eniach es eruva bi'ir gidola, mahalech es kula v'chutzala apayim ama. Aye. But if you go ahead and you place your Eruv in a particular city, so remember again, the placement of an Eruv creates a domicile. Once you create a domicile in a particular city, then what? Then the city is your Dalet Amas. It was an incredible idea. Rav Yosef Amar, Amar Rav Yosef Amar Rav Huna, Irshio Shevas Asasan. So we'll say, so just so you know, only because we don't have a lot of time, but I want to make sure that we're able to close out these concepts. So the Gemara says, let me just, it was Shulchan Aruch writes in Siman Tov Ches Sif Aleph Lefichach Kishu Mahalich Mimakom Eruvo Lemachar Apayim Ama Keneged Ha'ir O Mahalich Bir Ad Sof Midah. So you know what? Actually, we're going to hold on to it until afterwards if we have time, because it requires the next sugi as well. Jose, but just keep in mind, I'm sorry, so much to do, so little time. But just understand what we have so far is, first of all, this concept that was introduced by the Gemara before, namely that halacha l'maisa, if you extend your tchum in one direction, it's not just the pshat that whatever amma you gain in the east, you lose in the west, but the Gemara introduced this concept that halacha l'maisa, if you extend your tchum to the east, when measuring to the west, you count 2,000 amas from your home. And if it ends in the end of the middle of the city, that's where it ends. The only possibility is where? Is halacha l'maisa, when measuring to the west from your home, it ends outside of the city, then what? Then the entire city is looked at as Dalet Amas, which then leads the Gemara to go on to this point, we'll call it Rav Idi's point, even though Rav Idi disagrees with it, that whenever measuring the tchum, if your tchum ends in the middle of a city, that's where the tchum ends. However, if the tchum ends at the edge or past the city, then what? The entire city is looked at as Dalet Amas. But that's only when you're measuring by foot. If you were to place an Eruv in a city, Erev Shabbos, then it appears that everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, that entire city becomes like your Dalet Amas. Good. So an interesting case. Amar Rav Yosef. Amar Rami bar Abba Amar Rav Huna. Irsho Shevas Hasas Hanachal. Interesting case. If you have a city that sits on the edge of a ravine. Now Rashi says over here, amok, it's very deep. So essentially, if you could imagine, it sits at the edge of a cliff, right? Of a ravine. That's a nachal, is a ravine. So what happens? We'll say, im yesh lefana daka arba'a modedin la misvas hanachal. If halacha l'maisa, there is a daka, we'll say, we saw this yesterday, is a doorway. If there's a doorway that's at least 4 amas, now this is amas, you'll see the Gemara is going to make this distinction, 4 amas tall, then halacha l'maisa, you could measure the tchum from the edge of the ravine. Ve'im lav, but if there is no doorway, entranceway that is 4 amas tall, ein modedin la elami pesach beiso, then the tchum is not measured from the edge of the city, which is by the edge of the ravine, but rather the tchum is going to be measured ultimately from the entranceway of one's home. Now, we'll say, now take a look at Rashi just a moment. Im yesh lefana daka mechitza arba amos kova al pnei kala ir kula misfas hanachal. So let's listen to this. So essentially what it's saying is like this. If you have a 4 amma fence, right? That's really what it's saying with doorway. You have a 4 amma doorway across the edge of the city that borders the ravine, then you could begin to count the tchum from the edge of the ravine. But if there is no 4 amma doorway, then you must begin to count the tchum ultimately from where? Halacha l'maisa, from your home. Now, why is that? Look at Rashi. Ve'im lav kevan de ve'isa tashmish sayu lo havi yishuv kavua v'avalei kiyoshrei tzrifis. Well, this is fascinating because since there's no doorway between the city and the ravine, there's a danger. Because there's a danger, people won't easily access or easily use that area next to the ravine. And therefore, interestingly enough, Rashi says this is more like a settlement of huts. So as remember we had last week, this concept that if you have a settlement of huts, that doesn't form a community. Rather, every hut dweller measures his tchum from the entranceway of his hut. So if you have a city that borders on a ravine, and there is no fence in front of that ravine, that's not called a community. That's called a series of homes, and therefore everybody goes ahead and measures the tchum from their home. So the Gemara says, "Only abaye daka arba amos amartlan Allah my shnomi called daki da amo darba." But I don't say when we learned about daka doorways, remember we had this yesterday by the ladders. But when we spoke about doorways by the ladders, it was never 4 amos. Rather, what was it? It was 4 tfachim. So why is it over here that it's 4 amos? Yet yesterday in the latter cases it was 4 tfachim. Amalei hansam lo ba'isa tashmishta hacha. Ba'isa tashmishta. Suppose say very simply, the Gemara says because the doorways were serving 2 separate purposes. In yesterday's daf, the doorway was just there to demarcate a different rishus. So really, all you need is a symbolic entranceway. Here, you really need a fence, right? It's not just simply a doorway. This is a wall to keep people from falling into the ravine. 4 tfachim is nothing. 4 amis will be substantive. Amr Rav Yosef Minamin Allah. From where do I know this? This Sanya. Hitirebi Shiu B'nei Geder Yordin L'Cham. So it's very interesting. So let's listen to this. Really, actually, a fascinating case. So the Gemara says. Fine. So Hitirebi Shiu B'nei Geder Yordin L'Cham. So we'll say if you see you have a picture in Rashi, there were 2 cities, Geder and Chamson. So both were situated on a hill. Geder was above, Chamson was on the bottom. Rebbe permitted the residents of Geder to go to Chamson. Ve'in b'nei Chamson olin legeder. But the residents of Chamson were not permitted to go to Geder. He'll say, listen to this. My time, why is that? Lab mishum dahani avudaka, v'hani la avudaka. So we'll say, bepashtos, there must have been because the residents of Geder made for themselves a wall. Right, they made for themselves a wall at the edges. So you see that picture in Rashi. They made for themselves a wall. Therefore, again, they were able to measure their tchum from the wall and on, and that allowed them access into Chamson. The residents of Chamson never made a wall, and therefore they had to measure their tchum from their homes, not from the edge of the city, and therefore were unable to go ahead and enter into Geder. To which the Gemara says, Ki Asr Avdimi Amar, he said, no, that's not the reason. We'll say first wide line. Amar, Tatrugi mitatrigi lehu b'nei Geder lebnei Chamson. Now we'll say, in fact, it's because the people of Geder used to beat up the people of Chamson. So Rebbe said to the people of Chamson, don't go to Geder. This has nothing to do with measuring a tchum. They are both in the tchum of each other. But again, apparently it was dangerous to the people of Chamson to go to the people of Geder. Umay hitir. What does it mean ultimately, again, that Rebbe allowed? Hiskin. He went ahead and he instituted. So we'll say essentially what he said was as follows. He said that halacha l'maisa, the people of Chamson cannot go to the residents of Geder. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, they were in danger. The people of Geder were a rough bunch. So therefore, but the people of Geder could go to Chamson. That means in Rebbe Hiskin, nothing to do with Erev. This is not an Eruvin Shaila. Not an Eruvin Shaila. This is a Ben Adam Lechavero Shaila. So ultimately, again, he allowed the residents of Geder to go to Chamson, but not Chamson to go to Geder. My Hiskinu, my Shna, Shabbos. So I'll say, so I don't understand. So what does that have to do with Shabbos? In other words, if the residents of Chamson would get beat up when they went to Geder, so why was it only prohibited for them to go to Geder on Shabbos? It should be prohibited to go to Geder all the time. To which the Gemara says, Maishna Shabbos, the Shchicha B'Shechrus. Because most say people drink on Shabbos. So because they drink on Shabbos, there could be a little bit of drunkenness. Because a little bit of drunkenness, things tend to get a bit lebedig. I will say, why aren't we concerned that the people of Geder come to Chamson? they're going to beat up the Chamson people there. In other words, if we don't want the people from Chamson to go together because we're afraid they're going to get beat up, so why aren't we afraid that if we allow the people of Geder into Chamson, the people of Geder will beat up the people of Chamson in their town? To which Shabbos is a great line. The Gemara says, Kalba below masya shev shnin lo nabach, because everyone knows that a dog outside of its city doesn't bark for 7 years, which Shabbos says sounds much better in the Aramaic. But you understand the idea being that people are generally more timid when they are not in their home surroundings. So that even though the people of Geder, when they're not home, again, they're not really going to start up with the people of Chamson. To which the Gemara says, but if that's the case, so aren't we concerned that halacha l'maisa then when the people of Geder show up in Chamson, that the people of Chamson are going to get their revenge and the people of Geder, for all the times the people of Geder beat them up? To which the Gemara says, very interesting, Kuli hai lo kaifeluhu. While it is true that the people of Geder are a bit more subdued when they're not at home and they come to Chamson, but if the people of Chamson do start up with them, they will hold their own ground. So Rav Safra Amar Ir ha'asui ki keshes habi. Rav Safra says, no. The case actually was that it was a city that was made like a bow. Chamson was a city which was fashioned like a bow. Once we had this case, the Gemara says, and what? Ir ha'asui ki keshes habi. Rav Din Bar China Amar, and therefore we'll say, because it was Ir ha'asui ki keshes, and what happened? Rashi says over here, the two ends of the city were more than 4,000 amas apart. What happens, remember, we had this on first day's Yom Tiv. What happens when the edges of the city, the tops of the U, are more than 4,000 amas apart? You begin to count the tchum from the homes. So it turns out that, in fact, that Geder was outside of the tchum of Chamsa, and that's why they couldn't get there. So the Gemara says, Rav Dimi Bar Chinana Amar Anshe Ir Gedola Va'anshe Ir Ketana Havi. So we'll say ultimately again, Rav Dimi Bar Chinana says, no. What's the case? The case is where Geder was an Ir Gadol, and therefore its tchum allowed them to go into Chamson. Chamson was an Ir Ketana, smaller city, and its tchum did not extend into Geder. So the Gemara says, Rav Kahana Masni Hachi, Rav Tivyumi Masni Hachi, Rav Safar, Rav Dimi Bar Chinana, Chad Amar Ir Ha'asui Ki Keshes Havi, V'chad Amar Anshe Ir Ketana Va'anshe Ir Gidol Havi. All right, so we'll say, so they just had a machlokes in attribution. So either way, what came out of the Brisa was the people of Geder could go to Chamson, the people of Chamson could go to Geder. 3 different interpretations as to why that was. Interpretation number 1, nothing to do with Eruvin, just didn't want that. Rebbe didn't want them getting beaten up. The people of Geder were a rough bunch. Therefore, he says to the people of Chamson, don't go on Shabbos when people are drinking to Geder. People of Geder can go to Chamson. Possibility 2 is that ultimately Chamson was a city shaped like a bow, but it was more than 4,000 amos at the edges. Therefore, again, Geder was outside of their tchum. Possibility number 3 is that Geder was an Ir Gadol, a large city, and therefore Chamson was within its tchum. Chamson was a small city, and therefore Geder was not in its tchum. Mishnah, Anshe Ir Gedola Mahalchinis Kol Ir Ketana. So now this is the Mishnah we just quoted before. So Anshe Ir Gedola Mahalchinis Kol Ir Ketana. So the residents of a large city could go ahead and walk the entirety of a small city. Anshe Ir Ketana Mahalchinis Kol Ir Gedola. And the residents of a small city could also go ahead and walk the entirety of a large city. Kate said, I will say, so when is that? Mishahaya bi'ir gidola, if someone was a resident of the large city, v'nas when I say ruva bi'ir kitana, but he actively placed an eruv. So let's remember again, this is the case of no saint. He actively places an eruv in the small city, or bi'ir kitana v'nas when I say ruva bi'ir gidola, or he's a resident of the small city, and he actively places his eruv in the large city. Mahalich eskula v'chutzala alpayim amma. So we'll say, so remember again, whenever you're placing your eruv in a city, what happens? What happens? That city becomes like your Dalet Amos. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva says no. Rabbi Akiva says no. Listen, Rabbi Akiva does not subscribe to this concept that when you place your Eruv in a city, the entire city becomes like your Dalet Amos. Rabbi Akiva says you have 2,000 Amos from the place where you put your Eruv. That's it. That's it. You measure 2,000 Amos from there. Rabbi Akiva says, after all, don't you agree with me that if a person places their Eruv in a cave, that you go ahead and you measure 2,000 amos from where you put the Eruv? Amrulo, they said to him, Emasai, Bisman Shein Badiyurin. That's true, and there are no residents in the cave. Aval Yesh Badiyurin Mahalech Eskula V'chutzla Paim Amma. So the Gemara says, but yet they said to Rabbi Akiva, when there are people who live in the cave, they asked the entire area of the cave would be treated like an area of Dalet Amas, and you count the rest of the tchum from the edge of the cave. Nimtza kal tocha me'al gaba. Therefore, also you see that in certain respects, sometimes the interior of a cave is treated with greater leniency than the exterior of the cave. We'll see what that means. Ulamodei sha'amnu nosna alpayim ama. And ultimately, again, I will say, but when you're measuring your tchum, everyone will agree that what? When measuring, which means you're counting on Shabbos 2,000 amas, you didn't place an Eruv anywhere, wherever the tchum ends, even if it is in the middle of, right? Even if it is in the middle of the Ma'ara, middle of the cave. So we'll say, what comes out over here is a fundamental yisodistic machlokes. So again, you have the Tanakama essentially saying that halacha l'maisa, when you place an Eruv in a city, the entire city becomes your dalam. So we'll say, you have to understand, that is a huge halacha. It's a huge halacha, because what that does is it dramatically extends your tchum. Rabbi Akiva says, no. That is not true. When you place an Eruv, what that does is it extends your tchum. You can then count 2,000 amas ultimately again from wherever you place the Eruv. But the city is measured just as regular, we'll call it regular square footage, regular square amage, right? There's no such thing as the entire city becoming Dalet Amas. Says Dino, I'll say Amud Beis. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Shavas bi'ir chareva. Supposed to listen to this case. What happens if a person goes ahead and Shabbos is supposed to place it, he makes his damasal, which means Erev Shabbos, he placed an Eruv in an uninhabited city. Seir Chareva means an uninhabited city. Rashi says, Be'er Chareva, Midiyu Reha, Ava Michitzoseh Kayamo Savela. So we'll say in this case over here, no one lives in the city, but the walls of the city are still there. So you have a mamish, a city, but no one lives there. What's the halacha? So the Gemara says, L'Rabbanon Mahaleches Kula V'chutz L'Apayim Amo. So according to the Rabbanon, what's the halacha bosai? A city is reckoned as Dalet Amas. That's it. City is reckoned as Dalet Amas. So you place your Eruv in a city, even if no one is living there, halacha l'maisa, the entire city is counted as Dalet Amas, and you count the rest of your tchum from there. However, Hiniach, so the Gemara says, Hiniach es Eruva be'ir chareva, ein lo makom Eruvo, ela alpayim ama. Yet I will say the Gemara quotes another opinion. The other opinion says that if a person places their Eruv in the Ir Chareva, an uninhabited city, all they have is what? They could count 2,000 amas from the place where they placed their Eruv. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Echad Shavos ve'echad Hiniach, Mahalich es kula v'chutzala apayim amas. Rabbi Eliezer says, so just actually to be etymologically clear, Shavas means that you yourself are literally there. Right? You've gone ahead and you've established your domicile. So look at these two different cases. So in case number one, there's Shavas Be'ir Chareva. A person goes ahead and literally establishes his domicile. He remains in the uninhabited city at the onset of Shabbos. According to the Rabbanon, the entire city is treated like Dalet Amas. Next case was Hiniach es Eruva Be'ir Chareva. If you just placed your Eruv in an uninhabited city, then what? Ein lo mimakom Eruva ela alpayim ama. The Rebbe say in that case, you just placed an Eruv, halacha l'maisa, you measure 2,000 amas from where you placed the Eruv, but the entire city is not looked at as your Dalet Amas. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, echad shavas ve'echad tiniach, mahalech es kula v'chutz la'apayim ama. Wow, comes along Rabbi Eliezer, he says, no, whether you went ahead and what? Placed the Eruv, or whether you yourself actually spent Shabbos, you established a physical domicile there, halacha l'maisa, the city is counted as your Dalet Amas, and you go ahead and count your 2,000 amas from the edge of the city. Shabbos says, so again, essentially, first opinion, ultimately Rabbi Eliezer making a distinction between Shabbos and Hiniach. If you yourself spend Shabbos in the uninhabited city, the entire city is treated like a Dalet Amas. You just placed your Eruv there, it's not your Dalet Amas, measure your 2,000 amas from wherever you placed your Eruv. Second, Rabbi Eliezer is saying, that's Shmuel. Rabbi Eliezer is saying no. Whether you placed your Eruv or you actually spent Shabbos there, halacha l'maisa, the entire city is treated like your Dalet Amas. Meisvei, Amr Hen Rabbi Akiva, Iatem Modin Libinos and Eruv Ba'ara. Don't you agree with me that if you place your Eruv, this is Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah, if you place your Eruv in the cave, she'ein lo mimakom Eruva ela alpayim ama, that halacha l'maisa, you measure your tchum 2,000 amos from where you went ahead and placed it, right, from where you placed your eruv, to which the Gemara says, they said to him, Emasai, Bisman Shein Badiurin. When is that Shirabosai that a cave doesn't count as of just Dalit Amas? That's when there are no residents in the cave. Ha be'ein badiurin module. So the Gemara said, well, say, what do you see from here? That the Rabbanan ultimately again agree with Rabbi Akiva that if there are no residents in an enclosed area, that halacha l'mais you measure the tchum from where the eruv is. So we'll say if that's the case, then even in an ir chariva, which is a city without residents, I don't understand. You should only be measuring the tchum from where you place the eruv, right? Remember again in the Mishnah, the Rabbanan seem to clearly make the ability to go ahead and look at a city as Dalet Amas based on the presence of residents. If there are no residents, then you should measure the tchum from wherever the eruv is. My ein badyurin, I don't know, what does it mean when the Rabbanan said there are no residents? Eina re'uya ledira. It's not fit for residential purposes. So I'll say, so for example, a cave is not fit for residential purposes. But for example, an Ir Chariva, which is an uninhabited city, is absolutely fit for residential purposes. So Tashma, let's analyze. Shavas Pi'ir, if a person went ahead and literally established his physical domicile in a city, Afilu Higidol Kantuchia, even if it's a large city like Kantuchia, or B'ma'ara, he established his Shabbos residence in a cave. Afilu Hikima'aras Tzidkio Melech Yehuda, because remember again, Tzidkio made subterranean tunnels, so that ultimately, again, when the Babylonians would invade, he would have an escape route. They were large tunnels. What's the halacha? Mahalech eskula v'chutz la'apayim ama. Ultimately, you're going to say you could traverse the entire cave, or you could traverse the entire city, and then it's all the entire cave, the entire city is treated like Dalet Amas, and you continue to count the rest of the tchum from there. Katani ir dumya dima'ara. So you see that the Gemara equates the city with a cave. Ma ma'ara chareva, just like a cave doesn't have residents. Af ir chareva, ultimately, again, the city in question also doesn't have residents. Vishavas in, and when is the city and when is the cave treated like Dalet Amas? Only if you established your eruv with your physical presence. Aval hiniach lo, but just placing your eruv there does not make the entire city or the entire cave like your Dalet Amas. So we'll say, whose opinion is that? So money, ilema Rabbi Akiva, my ir yechariva. According to Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi say, doesn't matter if the city is inhabited or uninhabited. Afilu yeshiva nami. According to Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi say, even if a city is fully inhabited, halacha lemaisa, Rabbi Akiva says you always measure from wherever your eruv is. Ela lav rabbanon. Rather, it must be the rabbanon of a taima de shavas. And the reason, ultimately, again, why the entire city, the entire cave is treated like Dalet Amas, is because you established your physical domicile there. So the taima de shavas in aval hiniach lo. To which the Gemara says, lo tema ir dumya de ma'ara. Don't say they were talking about a city that's like a ma'ara. Ela ima ma'ara dumya de ir. Rather, I will say that it is a cave that is like a city. How so? Ma'ir yeshiva. Af ma'ara yeshiva, just like the city is inhabited, so too the cave in question is also inhabited. V'Rabbi Akiva hida amar ein lo mimakom eruva ela alpayim ama. And it also reflects the view of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva in general holds inhabited cave, inhabited city. It doesn't make a difference. You always measure from wherever the eruv is. Umod, the Gemara says, ubeshab. I'm sorry. Ubeshavas modi. But I will say, ultimately, Rabbi Akiva apparently will agree that if you establish physical domicile, that enachinami, the entire city, the entire cave, could go ahead and be treated as Dalet Amas. V'hakim aras tzidkio ketani. But it says like the cave of Tzidkio, which also was an uninhabited cave. Kim aras tzidkio v'lo kim aras tzidkio. I will say it was like the inhabited cave of Tzidkio, not like the inhabited cave. How so? Kim aras tzidkio gidola. It was like the cave of Tzidkio in that it was large. V'lo kim aras tzidkio, but it wasn't like the cave of Tzidkio. Di'ilo hasam chariva v'hacha yeshiva. Because I will say ultimately again in the cave of Tzidkio, it was inhabited. It was uninhabited, excuse me. But in the cave in case in question, it was inhabited. So I'll say. So I'm gonna leave. I'll leave this last piece. We'll finish the parak Eretz Hashem tomorrow on Shabbos Yom Tov. But I just want to tell you just one piece of halacha with this because this is actually incredibly important. So the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, this is in Tov Ches Sif Beis. Shulchan Aruch writes as follows: if you place your Eruv in anything that is considered to be a private domain, which I will say means a cave, a city, an enclosed area, whether it's a very large city like Nineveh, or ultimately again it's an uninhabited city, or a cave that is fit for habitation. What's the halacha? Rabbi say again, we paskin ultimately like the Rabbanon, or really like Rabbi Eliezer, call at the top of the Gemara. Rabbi say whenever you place your Eruv in an enclosed Rishus HaYachid area, even if it's not inhabited, as long as it is fit for habitation, that entire area is treated like Dalet Amos. So Rabbi say, which is huge. So what that means is if you go ahead and you place your Eruv, Rabbi say this is whether you place your Eruv or this is whether you establish your makom shvisa with your physical presence. It doesn't matter. Either way, halacha lemaisa, the entire enclosed area is treated like your Dalet Amos, which I will say, of course, adds an incredible amount of space to your tchum amount. So we'll stop over here. We'll finish the last little piece. Emir Hashem b'Mesayim the parak on Shabbos on Shmini Atzeres. Shkoyach. Sorry for the little bit of the quick pace, but. It's a little